I guess we all have our heroes, don't we? Heroes being those people that we admire, that we look up to, that we would like to be like. You have your heroes, and I have my heroes. But it may surprise you to realize that one of my heroes, in fact, one of my best heroes, is Thomas. That may seem strange to you because we have attached to him the moniker Doubting Thomas, which is certainly a negative term. And as I was growing up, maybe as you, I was told by family and Sunday school teachers, don't be a doubting Thomas. I am. But let me explain it just a little bit. And maybe you can understand why Thomas is one of my heroes. But to explain it, I need to take you on the journey that Thomas and the disciples went on. And we began that journey in Galilee with Jesus saying, I'm going to Jerusalem. And in Jerusalem, I'm going to suffer and I'm going to die. And the emotions of the disciples fall. As they begin this journey to Jerusalem with an incredible foreboding of disaster and pain and death. Yet as they journeyed to Jerusalem, little by little, those feelings were lifted as more and more people began to join with them. And the numbers of disciples following Jesus grew almost every day. So that by the time Jesus arrived at the gates of the city, there were hundreds of disciples there. And those disciples began to shout out, Hosanna, blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. And the foreboding tone of Jerusalem now got lost in rejoicing, for it seemed like Jesus was coming into his own, and people recognized him for who he truly was. But no sooner had he gotten inside the gates of the city to the temple that this normally mild-mannered man goes into a rage and begins to turn over the tables of the money changers and drive out the animals that are there. What is going on? You see, the disciples are caught in this world of what is this that's happening around us? And with the anger and the outward demonstration of Jesus, the authorities turned against them. And throughout the week, they criticized him and called him into question. And that ominous tone begins to rise once again. And then they all sat down at a table with Jesus to celebrate the Passover. And it was like everything had finally come together, because that's why they went to Jerusalem, wasn't it? To celebrate the Passover in the shadow of the temple. For that was the goal of everyone who was faithful. And they came to the table in that spirit of celebration and accomplishment, only to hear Jesus start saying things like broken body and shed blood and new covenant. And they didn't understand what Jesus was talking about. No sooner had they gone out from the supper, Jesus was arrested, carried off like a common criminal, and the next morning, Jesus was on a cross dying. And that evening, as the sun was setting, they took down his body, for he had died, and hastily laid it in a borrowed tomb because the Sabbath was beginning. And they huddled together in fear. Fear that what had happened to Jesus was a fate that awaited them. Fear that what they had worked for was now gone. Fear that their future didn't exist because the one they had followed was no longer there to follow. And when the Sabbath was over, the women went to the tomb and came back with this strange tale of the body being gone and angels telling them that they had risen. And that very evening, the disciples all gathered together to try to make sense out of this roller coaster they had been on, trying to figure out what was next. And they gathered in fear for all of those on the outside who looked at them as the followers of Jesus. Yet even as they were together, they looked up, and lo and behold, there's Jesus among them, a risen Christ. And they saw Him, and they touched Him, and they heard Him, and they knew that the stories of the women were not idle tales after all. But Jesus truly had been raised from the dead, and that changed everything. But Thomas wasn't with them. And when they told Thomas, Thomas said, "Whoa, hang on. I got to see this one with my own eyes. I got to touch this one with my own hands. And until I have done that, I will not believe." And because of that, we call him Doubting Thomas. But you see, there's another little piece of the story we have to remember. For when Jesus said, "I'm going to Jerusalem and I'm going to suffer and die," the other disciples said, "No, Jesus, don't go. Stay here in Galilee. We can carry out a ministry here where you're loved." But it was Thomas who said, "Lord, if you're going to Jerusalem, I'm going with you. And if you're going to die, I'm going to die with you." And when they were sitting at that table at the Passover, and Jesus was telling them all of these things about the new covenant and where He was going, while all of the other disciples sat around scratching their heads trying to figure out what He's talking about, Thomas said, "Hold it, Jesus. We don't know where you're going. You're going to have to show us the way." You see, when we put all of the pieces together, we realize that Thomas's doubt was simply a desire to experience for himself what the other disciples had already seen and heard and touched. And in Thomas, we see that wonderful commitment that is willing to go where Jesus goes, that is willing to ask the questions to find out what he does not yet know, who yearns for that personal relationship with a risen Christ. Now, folks, if Doubting Thomas is a sinner, then God make me a sinner too. For I long to be like Thomas, who goes with Jesus wherever that is, who dares to ask the right questions instead of taking somebody else's word for it and pretending like I have all of the answers. I long to be like Thomas, who wants to spend time with the risen Christ Himself, not simply base his faith on what others have told him. If that's a sin, then God make us sinners. For you see, I think Doubting Thomas is the absolute model of what Christ wants us to be as disciples, who are so committed and so involved that we don't rely on somebody else for our faith, but experience that faith for ourselves. Oh God, make me a doubting Thomas. Amen.